Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, June 20th, 2024. The Supreme Court rejects an attempt to rule that a tax on wealth is unconstitutional. CNN says independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has not qualified for the presidential debate the cable network will be hosting next week, with Democratic nominee expected, Joe Biden, and presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump. The U.S. House Intelligence Committee Chair, Republican Mike Turner, warns about Russia's nuclear anti-satellite capabilities, saying if Russia ever used it, it could lead to a dangerous day zero that wipes out communication systems worldwide. Biden administration says it will divert Patriot air defense systems that were due to go to other countries to Ukraine to protect its cities and critical infrastructure from Russian attacks. State Department will give the latest on the Middle East and U.S. diplomatic efforts to prevent a full-scale war breaking out between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group in Lebanon. Republican U.S. Senator Joni Ernst tries to pass a resolution calling on President Biden to fire the chair of the FDIC, Martin Gruenberg, over reports of a toxic workplace, but the resolution is blocked by Democrats. Senate Education Committee holds a hearing on challenges facing public school teachers, and the mayor of Rochester Hills, Michigan, Republican Brian Barnett, talks about last weekend's shooting at a splash pad in his city. Story from Politico: the Supreme Court on Thursday rejected a conservative-backed bid to preemptively block Congress from ever adopting a wealth tax. The ruling is a victory for progressives like Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts, who are pushing to create a broad tax on the assets of the super rich, one that would go beyond income taxes and other levies on their earnings. The justices voted 7-2 to turn aside a complaint from a Washington state couple that a special tax Republicans created in 2017 on businesses overseas profits amounted to a federal property tax, something that's restricted by the Constitution. That was from Politico. There are more Supreme Court decisions to be released on Friday. One pending case is whether former President Donald Trump has absolute immunity against prosecution for actions taken while in office. Today, as USA Today reports, independent candidate for president Robert F. Kennedy Jr. failed to qualify for the June 27th CNN debate, leaving President Joe Biden and former President Trump to face off with one another. The deadline to qualify for the debate was 12 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time Thursday. To qualify, candidates must appear on a sufficient number of state ballots to reach the 270 electoral vote thresholds to win the presidency and receive at least 15% in 4 qualifying national polls prior to the eligibility deadline, according to a CNN news release. RFK Jr. had received at least 15% in 3 qualifying polls and was on the ballot in 6 states, making him eligible for only 89 electoral college votes, according to CNN. That was as reported by USA Today. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. posting on X, Presidents Biden and Trump do not want me on the debate stage, and CNN illegally agreed to their demand. My exclusion by Presidents Biden and Trump is undemocratic, un-American, and cowardly. Americans want an independent leader who will break apart the two-party duopoly. They want a president who will heal the divide, restore the middle class, unwind the war machine, and end the chronic disease epidemic. That posting from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And now to U.S. relations with Russia. A Newsmax article previewing a program today reads, House Intelligence Chair Mike Turner, Republican from Ohio, who has been pushing the Biden administration to declassify information on Russia's nuclear anti-satellite program, is planning an address Thursday warning that the situation could become catastrophic if information about the looming threat is not addressed soon. Congressman Turner spoke at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
This crisis is the Cuban Missile Crisis in space, and the administration is failing. The advances that mankind has made during the space age are at risk, and the administration is sleepwalking into an irreversible day zero. Dr. Plum, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, testified before the House Armed Services Committee that Russia's nuclear anti-satellite weapon, if detonated in low Earth orbit, would indiscriminately decimate all satellites within low Earth orbit and would render that orbit and space unusable for likely at least a year. Mankind would be unable to repopulate low Earth orbit satellites during this period, and manned space exploration would be deadly. This threat would mean that our economic, international security, and social systems come to a grinding halt. This would be a catastrophic and devastating attack upon Western economic and democratic systems. Vladimir Putin knows this. Checkmate. Day zero can be avoided. Imagine how different the world would have been if President Kennedy had allowed Khrushchev to place nuclear weapons in Cuba. Europe would not be free. The United States would have been too fearful to challenge Russia in Europe with nuclear weapons just off the coast of Florida. Just as Khrushchev could have held the United States hostage with nuclear threats from Cuba, Vladimir Putin will hold the world's space assets hostage to counter attempts to stop him from reassembling the Soviet Union. There is precedent for Russian-United States nuclear weapons control treaties to include the dismantling of destabilizing weapons, inspection regimes, and prohibitions against deployment. But such treaties are negotiated through strength, something the Biden administration seems incapable of showing. In order to avoid day zero, the Biden administration must immediately declassify all known information concerning the status of Russia's nuclear anti-satellite weapons program. Vladimir Putin thrives in secrecy. Putin's plans and weapons programs must be fully disclosed by the administration and understood by the world. In addition, the United States and its NATO allies must join together to declare the resolve to enforce the UN Outer Space Treaty. I call on the Biden administration to do so.
Congressman Michael Turner, Republican from Ohio, chair of the Intelligence Committee, speaking today in Washington at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His committee in February informed all members of Congress about an unspecified serious national security threat. Then the White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby confirmed the threat was related to a Russian anti-satellite capability, although he did not confirm at the time the capability was nuclear. Today, John Kirby was holding an online audio news conference at about the same time as Congressman Turner's speech, and a reporter asked John Kirby about it.
Mike Turner is giving a speech saying that the Biden administration isn't taking the threat seriously enough of Russian space-based nukes. What's your response to that?
Well, he's just wrong. He's just flat out wrong. Look, we have absolutely taken this very seriously. We've been working this particular problem set from every possible angle, including through intense diplomacy with countries around the world, and obviously through direct conversations with Russia. We've been working hard to get other countries to join us in making clear that what the dangers are of an anti-satellite weapon that's designed to carry a nuclear weapon, just like the one that Chairman Turner is referencing. And we put forth a resolution at the UN Security Council to do that just about a month or so ago. As we said at the time in February, when this was made public, publicizing this highly sensitive intelligence was highly irresponsible. And it was something that the intelligence community themselves had serious concerns with. And we had assessed that starting with private engagement rather than immediately publicizing the intelligence would have been a much more effective approach. So obviously, as we said at the time, and we still are, disappointed that opportunity was prevented by Chairman Turner's letter and thus making it public. Nevertheless, what I can say is we're going to continue our efforts to dissuade Russia from putting a nuclear weapon into orbit. We're going to do everything possible to prevent that outcome. This is a national security issue, and quite frankly, it's not something that anyone should be playing politics one way or the other. All nations, all individuals, anybody in public service, particularly here in this country, ought to be similarly concerned about the manner in which we talk about this and the approach that we take to try to stymie the Russian plans.
John Kirby, White House National Security Communications Advisor, during a virtual audio press conference. Story from AP. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed at least a dozen deals with his Vietnamese counterpart on Thursday and offered to supply fossil fuels, including natural gas, to Vietnam during a state visit that comes as Moscow is seeking to bolster ties in Asia to offset its growing international isolation over the war in Ukraine. The agreements between Russia and Vietnam were not as substantial as the pact Putin signed with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un Wednesday, which pledged mutual aid in the event of invasion. That was from Associated Press. U.S. Senators Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, and Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, have long called for the United States to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, which would trigger automatic sanctions. The two held a news conference today on Capitol Hill. Senator Blumenthal held up a photo of President Putin's visit to North Korea and said now is the time for a vote on their bill.
Two of the most autocratic, atrocity-committing leaders in the world standing together, terrorist sponsors. This picture says it all. Russia deserves to be, in fact, it's deeply earned the designation to be a state sponsor of terrorism. And so far as the practical consequences are concerned, yes, sanctions would be strengthened, and yes, there would be practical consequences, but in my view, this message to the world is as important in a moral sense as any practical consequence. Russia deserves to be in this small, selective club of atrocity-committing killers. And Russia deserves to be designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. So we're going to pursue this fight. It is bipartisan. We have other supporters. And it is a priority for me, having seen in very personal ways what Russia has done in Ukraine. We visited in Bucha the site of the mass graves. Women and children, hands tied behind their back, shot in the head. We have talked to prosecutors about Russia kidnapping children and indoctrinating them in Russia, taking them away from their loved ones and parents. We have seen firsthand the kind of terrorism that Russia has committed and sponsored around the world. And I believe that the United States Senate has to take a stand.
Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, at a news conference with Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, talking about their bill to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Senator Roger Wicker, Republican of Mississippi, ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, also brought up Russian President Putin's visit to North Korea as he spoke on the Senate floor today about his committee's approval of the annual Pentagon Programs and Policies Bill called the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. The top line in the Senate version, $923 billion, about $25 billion more in defense spending than the cap set by last year's agreement to raise the nation's debt ceiling.
For the first time in 24 years, this week, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin visited the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. This rare trip was a sign of a new reality, and it amounts to bad news for the United States and for our alliance and for the forces of freedom around the world. An axis of aggressors continues to emerge, and this visit by Putin to Kim Jong-un is just the latest sign. Our adversaries, Russia, North Korea, China, the Ayatollahs, Iran, have been banding together to create a world that is less free, less peaceful, and less prosperous for the American people. Every member of the Senate knows this. And we have an opportunity to respond. And there is a glimmer of good news, Mr. President. Last week, the Senate Armed Services Committee, of which I am a member, overwhelmingly voted to move the National Defense Authorization Bill forward. We wrote the bill specifically to address this rising danger. Our near unanimous support for passage of the NDAA is a sign that we agree on at least one thing, The United States is not ready to stand up to this axis of aggressors, this new group who are banding together and assisting each other as they never have before. And we don't have time to waste. The Armed Services Committee has put that conviction into practice. Senators from both sides of the aisle added an additional $25 billion to the legislation, to the top line of this legislation. $25 billion, which would invest in the munitions and systems we need to confront this axis and to prevent war, to preserve the peace and prevent war.
Senator Roger Wicker, Republican from Mississippi, ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, speaking on the Senate floor today. The vote on the National Defense Authorization Act in his committee on June 13th was 22-3, sending it to the full Senate for future debate. Story from the New York Times. Mark Rutte, the departing Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who has guided more than $3 billion in Dutch military support to Ukraine since 2022, on Thursday clinched the last assurance he needed to become NATO's next Secretary General. On Thursday, the president of Romania dropped his bid to lead NATO, making it all but certain that Mr. Rutte would be formally elected to a 4-year term at the helm of the Atlantic Alliance. That could take place as soon as next week, ahead of a high-level NATO summit in Washington in July. Some of the reporting from the New York Times. This from the Washington Post. The United States will suspend the planned export of hundreds of air defense munitions to its allies and partners and redirect them to Ukraine, the White House said Thursday, as Russia continues its assault on the country's power grid and other vital infrastructure. Speaking to reporters, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby characterized the decision as difficult but necessary and said it would affect deliveries of Patriot and NASAMS interceptor missiles principally. That was from the Washington Post. Here is John Kirby in an online audio news conference.
As we've heard from President Zelensky, the Ukrainian military is in desperate need of additional air defense capabilities. We take our partnership seriously, especially when a partner like Ukraine is in such jeopardy. Right now, we know that Ukraine urgently needs these additional capabilities. We have continued to dig deep and provide Ukraine with a variety of air defense systems and interceptor missiles from our own stockpiles, including those of the Patriot system, NASAMS, and of course the Hawks. Many of our allies and partners have stepped up in historic ways as well, but obviously more is needed, and it's needed now. So as a result, the United States government has made the difficult but necessary decision to reprioritize near-term planned deliveries of foreign military sales to other countries of particularly Patriot and NASAM missiles to go to Ukraine instead. So let me just take a moment to explain what this means. As you know, the United States has a robust foreign military sales program where our defense industrial base produces and then exports material to other countries, including, of course, air defense missiles. And what we're going to do is we're going to reprioritize the deliveries of these exports so that those missiles rolling off the production line will now be provided to Ukraine. This will ensure that we'll be able to provide Ukraine with the missiles they need to maintain their stockpiles at a key moment in the war, and as we get, again, towards the end of summer and into the fall. As a result, deliveries of these missiles to other countries that are currently in the queue will have to be delayed. To be clear, those countries will still receive the missiles that they have ordered. It's just that the delivery timelines will now take a little longer. We have, of course, informed all the affected countries that we are taking this extraordinary step, and we're making every effort to minimize any negative impact to countries with affected foreign military sales cases.
John Kirby is White House National Security Communications Advisor, part of his virtual audio news conference today. Story from Politico. The U.S. has told Ukraine it can use American-supplied weapons to hit any Russian forces attacking from across the border, not just those in the region near Kharkiv, according to U.S. officials. The subtle shift in messaging, which officials insist is not a change in policy, comes just weeks after the U.S. quietly gave Kyiv the green light to strike inside Russia in response to a cross-border assault on the city of Kharkiv. At the time, U.S. officials stressed that the policy was limited to the Kharkiv region, among other restrictions. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told PBS on Tuesday that the agreement with Ukraine about firing American weapons into Russia extends to, quote, anywhere that Russian forces are coming across the border from the Russian side to the Ukrainian side to try to take additional Ukrainian territory. That was reporting from Politico. This all came up today at the Pentagon news conference with the press secretary, Pat Ryder.
National Security Advisor Sullivan said earlier this week that with regards to the policy allowing Ukraine to use U.S.-made weapons to strike over the border into Russia, that policy, quote, extends to anywhere that Russian forces are coming across the border from the Russian side to the Ukrainian side. So is that consistent with the Pentagon's understanding of this policy, or has the policy expanded beyond just that kind of narrow Kharkiv region that it was initially understood to be when this policy decision was made?
Yeah, so there has been no change in the policy. And really, at the end of the day, this comes down to counterfire, right? And what you saw in the Kharkiv region as Russia was conducting its offensive was the massing of forces, artillery fire, preparatory fire into Ukraine as they conducted these operations. And so the ability to be able to fire back when fired upon is really what this policy is focused on. So again, as we see Russian forces firing across the border, the ability for Ukraine to fire back at those ground forces using U.S. provided munitions, it's self-defense. And so it makes sense for them to be able to do that.
And that applies only to the border areas, or could it be further into Russia, or does that?
Again, if you look back at kind of the early days of this war, and you had Russian forces that were, and still are to a large degree, but en masse within Ukrainian occupied territory, what you saw were force-on-force conflicts that were happening within sovereign Ukraine. So in this case, what you see is Russian forces attempting to use their border as a safe zone from which to conduct preparatory fires and attacks into Ukraine in support of offensive actions. And so again, as we see those forces conducting those types of operations from across the border, we've explained, Ukraine can and does have the right to fire back to defend themselves. So again, not a change to the policy that was announced earlier. Now, when it comes to long-range munitions like ATACMS, again, there's been no change in the policy in that regard.
But it's broader than just Kharkiv, to be clear.
Correct. It's focusing on the strategic intent here, which is counterfire when you're attacked, returning fire.
Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder, an Air Force Major General, at the Pentagon news conference today. Story from The Guardian: a Russian-American ballerina who lives and works in Los Angeles has gone on trial for treason over an alleged donation of $50 to a pro-Ukrainian charity in the latest court case to raise tensions between Washington and Moscow. Ksenia Karolina, 32 years old, was detained by police in late January while on a trip to visit her family in Russia. Prosecutors accused her of proactively transferring funds to a Ukrainian organization which the Ukrainian armed forces subsequently used to purchase tactical medicine equipment, weapons, and ammunition. She faces up to 20 years in prison if found guilty. That was from The Guardian. Turning to the Middle East, from CNN, U.S. officials have serious concerns that in the event of a full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group could overwhelm Israel's air defenses in the north, including the much-vaunted Iron Dome air defense system, 3 U.S. officials told CNN. The U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, at his news conference in Washington, D.C., gave the latest on U.S. efforts to prevent all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah.
After Mr. Hochstein's visit to Israel and Lebanon, is it fair to say that the diplomatic solution has failed?
No, I don't think so. I think we continue to pursue very active diplomacy to try to keep this conflict from escalating. You've heard me say this before, and I'll say it again because it remains the case. The best way to unlock the possibility of a resolution along the Israel-Lebanese border would be achieving a ceasefire in Gaza. And we continue to actively pursue a ceasefire in Gaza, primarily to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza and to secure the return of hostages. But a very important side effect we assess would be making it much easier to achieve a ceasefire and diplomatic resolution along the Israel-Lebanon border. That said, We're not waiting for a ceasefire in Gaza. We're continuing to pursue diplomacy because it's important to do. But again, it's very difficult to reach such a resolution while the conflict in Gaza continues at the pace it is today.
And do you have any comments on Hezbollah Secretary General's speech yesterday and his threat to Cyprus? And did the Secretary discuss this topic with Cyprus foreign minister in their call yesterday?
So the meeting that he had with the governor of Cyprus was actually 2 days ago. So it's before the speech the Hezbollah speech that you referred to. So no, they obviously didn't discuss it because it hadn't happened yet. But obviously those comments are extremely unproductive, and Hezbollah should cease making threats against anyone. And our preference would be for Hezbollah to pursue a diplomatic resolution. I think that's the most productive, and certainly making threats at other countries that aren't involved in this conflict at all are not a productive step for them to be taking.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference. The question referred to Hochstein. That's Amos Hochstein, President Joe Biden's special envoy to the Middle East. Story from CNN. Israel's top military spokesman has said Hamas cannot be made to disappear, casting doubt about whether the government's war aim of defeating the militant group can be achieved and drawing a sharp rebuke from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said Wednesday in an interview with Israel's Channel 13 the idea that it's possible to destroy Hamas, to make Hamas vanish, that is throwing sand in the eyes of the public. That from CNN. Today is World Refugee Day. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees' annual report says about 120 million people, 1.5% of the world's population, are refugees, forced to leave their homes. About half are internally displaced within their countries. U.S. Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat from Maryland, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, spoke on the Senate floor today about this World Refugee Day and U.S. spending to help refugees.
Massive cuts proposed by House colleagues to the migration and refugee assistance accounts for FY25 would turn our back and imperil the lives of those most at risk. That is why this day I will be introducing, along with 21 of my Senate colleagues, a resolution reaffirming the importance of promoting the safety, health, and well-being of refugees and displaced persons in the United States and around the world. This means upholding the United States' long history of welcoming people from around the world who have been oppressed and persecuted. Our U.S. refugee admissions program, established in 1980, remains a life-saving pillar for resettling the most vulnerable refugees. It means further tapping into the deep generosity of Americans, as demonstrated by the United States government's Welcome Corps, through which private citizens are supporting newly arrived refugees themselves. It means supporting host communities, particularly in low and middle income countries, where 75% of all refugees are hosted, while advocating for refugee inclusion. It means continuing U.S. leadership by the State Department, USAID, and NGO partners in responding to displacement crises with humanitarian assistance and ensuring protection for forcibly displaced persons that are at risk of gender-based violence, human trafficking, and other human rights abuses. It means working in partnership with the international community to resolve conflicts, to address climate change that is destroying lands and livelihoods, and to hold human rights abusers accountable so that people can return to their homes. In taking these steps, we will not only uplift the lives of vulnerable people around the world, we will also promote regional stability and strengthen U.S. national security.
Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat from Maryland, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, on the Senate floor. Washington Today continues in a moment.
On Thursday, tune in to the CNN presidential debate, simulcast live on C-SPAN 2. Watch as the two presumptive nominees, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, face off as they try to earn your vote ahead of the general election in November. Our coverage begins at 8 p.m. Eastern with a preview of what's to come. And then at 9 p.m. Eastern, our simulcast of the CNN presidential debate. And following the debate, stay with C-SPAN as we take your calls and get your reaction to the first debate of the campaign season. The CNN presidential debate simulcast, live Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app, or online at cspan.org. C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of politics.
And that would be Thursday, June 27th. Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app, which is free, and wherever you find your podcasts. Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa, putting out a press release that reads, following reports of sexual harassment and discrimination at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, Senator Joni Ernst offered a resolution on the Senate floor demanding President Biden fire FDIC Chair Martin Gruenberg, which Democrats blocked, proving they are putting politics over protecting women in the workplace. That was the language from Senator Ernst's news release. Senator Ernst on the floor asked unanimous consent to pass a resolution, and then you'll hear Senator Debbie Stabenow, Democrat from Michigan, who objected.
Public reports say Gruenberg personally looked the other way when it came to sexism, harassment, and racial discrimination. Investigators determined Gruenberg himself had a reputation of, quote, losing his temper and interacting with staff in a demeaning and inappropriate way, end quote. They also claimed Gruenberg was either unable or unwilling to recognize his failures, except when the writing was on the wall. I am aware Gruenberg has agreed to resign, but only after the Senate confirms a replacement. By his own admission, Gruenberg must resign, not tomorrow, not next week, but today. But we all know why he's refusing to just quit today. If and when the FDIC chairmanship becomes vacant, the vice chair, who is currently a Republican, assumes the chairmanship. Now, President Biden has nominated someone to backfill Gruenberg, and I look forward to reviewing her record and her credentials. But we all know it will take significant time for her to go through the confirmation process and face a vote here in the Senate. Let us be crystal clear about what's happening. President Biden is letting a dirtbag run the FDIC for who knows how long because he cares more about politics than protecting women in the workplace. Mr. President, integrity means doing the right thing when no one is looking. At this turbulent time, the FDIC deserves a leader who acts with integrity, and Gruenberg's conduct doesn't fit the bill. Simply put, the time has come to turn the page on Martin Gruenberg. President Biden should put his money where his mouth is and fire him. But since Biden doesn't seem to remember his own pledge, it is the responsibility of the Senate to remind him of it. And for that reason, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of S. Resolution 742, which is at the desk. I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Senator from Michigan.
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President. First, I want to agree with my friend from Iowa. There's no question we need a new FDIC chair. We don't need a bunch of pot shots on the president using this for political purposes. We need a new FDIC chair. And the good news is that the president has already sent the Senate a nomination for a new chair. So first of all, this resolution isn't necessary, and it's not going to do anything to improve the culture of the FDIC. I wish it would, but it won't. The reality is that the Banking and Housing Committee is moving quickly to consider and report out the nomination. Additionally, I should just note the resolution has some factual inaccuracies that misrepresent the findings of the third-party report. But the most important thing is that The Senate should be focused on providing new leadership that can implement the recommendations of the third-party report and begin the much-needed overhaul of the FDIC.
Senator Debbie Stabenow, Democrat from Michigan, on the Senate floor. She went on to object to the unanimous consent request to pass the resolution as offered by Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa. Senator Ernst is also sponsoring legislation that would allow current and former FDIC employees who experienced discrimination or sexual harassment over the last decade to sue the agency, and another bill that, in her words, would prohibit sex criminals from collecting taxpayer-funded pensions. Story from the Detroit Free Press. 3 more victims of last Saturday's splash pad mass shooting in Rochester Hills were released from the hospital Tuesday, according to the Oakland County Sheriff's Office. Those released were 3 males, ages 4, 31, and 42, the Sheriff's Office said in a news release. A shooter opened fire Saturday evening at the Brooklands Plaza splash pad in Rochester Hills, leaving 9 people injured, some of them in critical condition. The suspect, identified as 42-year-old Michael William Nash, was found dead in a Shelby Township home from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. That was reporting from the Detroit Free Press. Today, the mayor of Rochester Hills, Brian Barnett, a Republican, spoke at the opening press conference of the U.S. Conference of Mayors annual meeting in Kansas City, Missouri.
My community is, by statistics, the safest city in Michigan for 7 years in a row, but it wasn't on Saturday. I got that call that so many mayors dread, that there is an active shooter in your splash pad or an active shooter in your city. I raced to the scene, and on my way there I thought what I needed to do and the strong stance I would take and the leadership I would provide. And the minute I arrived at the splash pad, I just broke down in tears. It was emotional because what was designed to be a place for kids to play, and you don't have to have visited my city to know who's at a splash pad. It's families and kids, mostly under 10. A gunman came up and fired 36 shots into 9 people, most of them kids. 2 of them still in critical condition every morning, including this morning. I wake up and the first thing on my mind is an 8-year-old boy in my city that got shot in the face, and his mom, whose body shielded him from 7 more shots as they fight their battle. And I'm reminded on this particular day that this is a cross-section that so many of the folks behind me have found themselves before at the intersection of mental health and gun violence. That it is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and if it happens in my community, as it has in so many of my colleagues' communities, it can happen in yours. The gunman took his life later that afternoon, and in his room just a community over from mine, they found 11 other guns and an assault weapon loaded on the table. His probably terror that day was stopped only by excellent police action, quick work. My job now is to try to heal a community that is challenged. Obviously, the shooter, had some strong mental health issues, and now the mental health of my community is my number one focus. It's been the focus of our president under her leadership, and it's something that is so needed across this country. And I'm here, maybe some wondering why 5 days you're here so quickly. I'm here for my mental health, because none of you on that side of this podium know what it's like, but most of the people behind me do. And my friends have been so incredibly supportive in the hours that followed the shooting, calls from the president, the governor, and so many others. But 70 of these people, 70 of the mayors that I stand with today, called or texted me in the 2 days that followed the shooting. They know what it's like. And so I'll add my voice with all of theirs in the chorus of concerns about gun violence and mental health and what we as a nation and we as mayors must do. And I support and applaud President Sheevy for her leadership on mental health. This is something that we must not ever rest on. And my community now joins the sad list of commas in cities that have been struck by gun violence. We won't be defined by this issue. We'll be defined by the response, and I know that's the mayor's stance as well. Thank you, President Sheevy.
The mayor of Rochester Hills, Michigan, Brian Barnett, a Republican, at the opening press conference of the U.S. Conference of Mayors annual meeting in Kansas City, Missouri today. The conference held sessions today on crime and safety, the economy, and homelessness. In Washington, D.C., the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee held a hearing today about challenges facing public school teachers. The chair of the committee, Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, spoke about his bill that would require teachers have a minimum salary of $60,000 per year.
According to the statistics that I have seen, the average starting teacher salary in America is less than $45,000 a year. Nearly 40% of school districts in our country pay teachers a starting salary of less than $40,000. Incredibly, the average public school teacher in America is making nearly $100 a week less than she or he did 28 years ago after adjusting for inflation. In other words, the real salaries of teachers are actually going down in inflation-adjusted numbers. Wages for public school teachers are so low that in 36 states throughout America, the average public school teacher with a family of 4 qualifies for food stamps, public housing, or other government benefits. In America today, nearly 20% of public school teachers in our country are forced to work 2 or 3 jobs during the school year. Maybe they are driving an Uber, maybe they are waiting tables, maybe they're parking cars. In the richest country in the history of the world, seems to me that we have got to do a lot better than that. Meanwhile, because of lack of resources and tight school budgets, about 80% of public school teachers are forced to spend their own money on classroom supplies without being reimbursed, which comes out to about 13% of their first monthly paycheck. The situation has become so absurd, and this tells us not just about how we feel about education and teachers, but maybe our sense of priorities as a nation. The situation has become so absurd that 4 hedge fund managers on Wall Street made more money last year than every kindergarten teacher in America, nearly 120,000 teachers. 4 hedge fund managers, more money than 120,000 kindergarten teachers. Public school teachers should not be forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. They should not be forced to be on food stamps.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, opening up today's hearing on public school teachers. State's Newsroom reporting on this hearing and citing one of the witnesses. The only reason John Arthur is able to be a public school teacher is because his wife makes much more money than he does. Arthur, the 2021 Utah Teacher of the Year, testified on Thursday at the hearing of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions on challenges facing public school teachers. The special education teacher spent most of his career in education as a paraprofessional. At the time he moved into that role, the starting annual salary was $16,000 and the maximum was $30,000. He said it's pretty much the same. That was from State's Newsroom. Back to the hearing, Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, the committee's ranking member, said that more money is not the solution to the problems facing teachers, students, and schools.
Spending has greatly exceeded inflation. But even beginning before the pandemic, we saw a decrease in math scores and a decrease in reading scores. The reading is 4th grade, the math is 8th grade. Now, in 2021, Democrats, through a partisan bill, gave $121 billion in one-time COVID spending with little accountability or requirements for how the money would be used. And it begs the question, where was it spent? Some school districts added new faculty positions like assistant principals that have limited impact upon classroom learning. There are now more staff collecting paychecks at schools than ever before, and yet we see grades falling. Now let's be clear, teachers are important. For a child to learn, they must have a teacher focused on teaching. But there's evidence, anecdotal, teachers are overwhelmed by policies that prevent them from truly managing classrooms and in some cases ensuring the safety of their students. We'll hear more about this from one of our witnesses today. Now, the Democrat solution to this challenge has been to create a federal minimum salary for teachers. improving teacher pay is important. In fact, out of the 11 states that passed laws this year increasing take-home pay for teachers, 10 have Republican-led legislatures, including Louisiana. But the federal government dictating how states spend their money does not address the root cause of why teachers are struggling to teach in the classroom. More mandates and funding cannot be the only answer we come up with. We must examine broken policies that got us here and find solutions to improve.
Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, ranking member on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee at today's hearing on public school teachers. Story from The Guardian, U.S. civil liberties groups have sued Louisiana for what they called its blatantly unconstitutional new law requiring all state-funded schools to display the Ten Commandments in classrooms. The ACLU joined with its Louisiana affiliate and two other bodies, Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the Freedom of Religion Foundation, for the suit against the law signed on Wednesday by the state's right-wing Republican Governor Jeff Landry, who succeeded the former Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards in January, provocatively declared after signing the statute, "I can't wait to be sued." That was reporting by The Guardian newspaper. The National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO, is holding its 41st annual conference in Las Vegas, and today, Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su spoke to the policymakers about the economy, immigration, and labor law.
Now, let me say another thing about the high road, which is that you can't build the high road if you don't combat the low road. And what I mean by that is, that's right, you guys know what I'm talking about. Like ending the use of illegal child labor. Many of them Latinos, 13-year-olds working on the kill floor of a meatpacking plant, cleaning overnight, working with dangerous chemicals, working with dangerous machines. We can't build the high road if we don't combat the low road by ending wage theft. And we have to tackle the problem that there are employers in our communities who've decided that it's cheaper to break the law, that the chances of getting caught are slim, and the consequences if you do get caught are minimal. And many of those same employers are the ones who weaponize immigration status to further their exploitation. We say to that, not on our watch. Enforcing labor laws is one of the most important things that government can do. It provides a floor beneath which nobody should have to live and work, and enforcing labor laws is good for law-abiding employers. It creates a level playing field so that the bad actors who break the rules don't determine what that industry looks like. So we are putting wages into workers' pockets. We're restoring the promise of a 40-hour work week by expanding overtime pay to millions of workers. We're protecting people's hard-earned retirement savings. And we're working on the first nationwide heat standard. We're in Las Vegas, but you can be almost anywhere right now in the country and know that is so important to protect workers from indoor and outdoor heat that is causing too many workers to get injured and even die on the job. And we're protecting workers from their immigration status being weaponized against them, so that now workers who come forward to report violations, who cooperate to help us enforce the law, we can't do our jobs if workers don't feel safe coming forward, can get deferred action and be protected so that their immigration status isn't a reason for them to live in fear. Because as we all know, working people, immigrants who come to this country to work, do not check their humanity at the border.
The Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su in Las Vegas at the annual meeting of NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. Wall Street today, the Dow up 299, NASDAQ down 140, S&P down 13. AAA says the number of people traveling 50 miles or more over the 4th of July weekend is expected to set a new record, 70.9 million. That's 5% higher than last year and 8% higher than 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter word for word, and you'll get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.